Okay, so I'm going to jump on in and begin with this. And actually, being an ambassador with that program kind of is gave me a lot of the ideas that I want to bring into this program tonight, which is looking at sort of what's in your yard, what do you want to have in your yard, and looking at the sort of crossover between personal preferences and ecological value that we value so much with the native plant community. And milkweed is a really good little ambassador here. Um, Milkweed is great. The common milkweed became very popular when we started to be concerned about the monarchs. However, it's not for every yard. In my work at Watermark Woods, I don't encourage everybody to put it in the front yard of their suburban home and an HOA. It's kind of a wild looking plant. And that's something we want to talk about tonight, this sort of wilder looking gardens, where you want to make those decisions. And this really gets into this whole idea of weediness. And we will also talk about invasives. Many of you watching this may have lots of your own input you'd like to share. I hope I can save some time at the end for other people to share their thoughts. So please write those in the chat, and Jeremy will keep track of that. Okay, and I could have subtitled this, How to Use Weedy Plants to Your Advantage. So I really think a lot about weediness in my studies of the gardens and in my just working in my own yard. I think about this weedy plants all the time, and how and then really the fun ways of thinking about that and using that in ways that can help you with your garden rather than make it harder to garden. So before I get into that, I just want to mention this is a quote from Doug Tallamy, who I do. If you don't know about him, you should look him up. There'll be some information that we will send to you, that you can find some information on Doug Tallamy, who has a lot to do with the native plant movement. And here I just want to talk about the ecosystem services of plants. That is just how important plants are to us. And not everybody thinks about plants all the time and realizes what a key role they play in so many ways. And as Doug Tallamy said in his article years ago, The Chickadee's Guide to Gardening, plants allow us and nearly every other species to eat sunlight. And they also produce oxygen, build topsoil, prevent floods, sequester carbon dioxide through their roots, buffer extreme weather, clean our water, and of course, feed our pollinators. So there's so many things that plants do for us. We call these ecosystem services. So that's one rationale for putting more plants, and especially native plants, into your yard. Doug Tallamy likes to recommend that you have 70% native plants, or that you shoot for that. So that's a guideline to go with. Okay, I want to talk, though, before we get talking about the actual plants, I just want to sort of talk about philosophical things about gardening that I think about a lot. So, you can make different choices, and at different times in your life, you'll want to make different choices about how you garden. These are some of the various things you can get from your home landscape. Of course, we value the top two ones, wildlife habitat and the other ecosystem services that I just mentioned, like holding soil in place and keeping the water, getting it down into the soil and keeping it there where your plants need it. We value those very much, but also it's okay to just enjoy your garden. And I didn't used to appreciate that part enough, the aesthetics and enjoyment. There's recreation. Sometimes it's a status for people, and then of course for food. So you can come to this in different ways, and I like to think about those choices. So and then some of your choices will be shaped by different things. And I like to really think about evolutionary psychology at the background of all of these things. And that's sort of like, we spent millions of years living in one wild habitat, right? And a very short time living the way we live now. I think about this all the time, and I think about how it forms the way we look at the world and our choices. And I think there's definitely evidence that it forms the way we look at our landscapes. So I think about the evolutionary psychology, but all of these other things too, like, you know, when people come to the nursery to buy plants, usually one member of the family is a lot more excited about going native or going with a wilder yard than other people are. These are things you have to consider. Um, and the life stage you're at. If you have a young baby or a very busy work schedule, you're not going to be able to do as much in your yard. So all of these things can shape your choices and preferences as we look at some of the options for you. So speaking of evolutionary psychology, I just want to mention the savanna hypothesis, which we hear about a lot. And I really love thinking about it because, again, I like thinking about all those millions of years we spent in a different environment. I don't think there's really much supporting data for this idea that this formed. It's even said by many, this formed our sort of love of lawns. But I do think that, and I was doing some research for this presentation. There is a preference that we humans have for landscapes that look like they're going to provide us resource abundance, which we do, of course, need resources. Everybody needs things to eat and drink, and also protection from survival threats. And so that may form sort of the background of what you bring to how you view your landscape at home. So that also, as I said, kind of leads us to, it's thought that that's one of the reasons we happen to like lawns so much. I think that I've done other talks just on lawns themselves, and I've read several books on this, and it's there's a lot of reasons we ended up with the lawn in America and other places too, but we're really known for our lawns. So that's kind of what we start with, and let's see where we go from there. So there's a movement, of course, you see it across the United States on social media and other places, to kind of move away from lawns, right? Because they're ecologically not very valuable, especially if you keep the grass really short and there's very few different sorts of plants in there, and they're mostly non-natives. And there's so many ways in which they're not performing the ecosystem services. But we also get asked a lot, can't you just let it go? What happens if you just let it go? And people try this every year. We've all done it in the past, and people are still doing it now because they tell me about it. It usually doesn't end very well to just let it go. And I think the sad thing is, I think there was probably a time, maybe 50 or 100 years ago, where you could kind of do that, because growing up on a farm here, I remember that if a farm was left fallow for a long time, it would grow up in things like broom sedge and red cedar, the native plants from this area that are what we call these pioneer species. And we're going to talk a lot about those tonight. But for various reasons, we have invasives now, and those will often create a monoculture. So then you have another monoculture instead of your lawn monoculture, and it doesn't provide much ecological value either. And these invasives didn't evolve here. They didn't evolve with our insects, and we want plants that will feed our caterpillars and the rest of our insects. And so anyway, you can't just let things go anymore. Unfortunately, you really have to manage landscapes, or they will just go to a few invasives that end up crowding out the native plants that we would like to see in those landscapes. So we're going to explore that a little bit more before we get to some plants that you might want to bring into your landscape. And so we're actually going to talk about weeds and invasives. And I really think of as invasives as just, they're just sort of super weeds and weeds on steroids. But, when you think about it, they're just simply very, very successful. And, they're like humans, right? We're very successful in spreading across the globe. That means that comes with consequences, but these are just very successful plants, especially at moving into areas that don't have anything else sort of dominating there. So let's just talk a little bit more about the background of that. And I like to talk about the difference between invasives and ordinary weeds, because many times people will tell me, People who aren't like very aware of the problem with invasives will say, well, I can tolerate this plant, like English ivy, for example, or autumn olive, and I actually like it, and it's fine. I'm going to let it go ahead and populate my yard. And I like to make the distinction between that's the sort of attitude you can have about dandelion. Dandelion is a non-native plant, but it's not, as far as I know, causing any harm really outside of your yard. If you choose to have it or not have it, that's really up to you. It can feed some bees. The flowers are nice. Maybe your neighbor doesn't like it, but really beyond your neighbor's house, you're not gonna cause any big impacts in the world. When you allow native plants or even allow invasive plants or even plant invasive plants in your yard, you're not just impacting what happens in your own yard. They invariably escape into our natural areas. Either birds carry the seeds or by other means. So there you're really having an impact on the larger ecosystem, not just on your own yard. So it really is important to note that difference between a non-native weed, which can be fine, and an invasive. And let's go a little bit into the background here and talk about what's a weed. And everybody might think they already have an idea of what a weed is. I'm sure there's many definitions of weeds. And actually, this is a famous list from a book from the 70s called Crops and Man that I really like. And it just shows that your definition of weeds depends upon the purpose you come to this with. So, for example, if you're talking to people who are professionally eradicating weeds, it's a plant out of place. It's growing where we don't want it. I love where he has Emerson here under enthusiastic amateurs, because I'm sure many of us have heard this. It's a plant whose virtues have not yet been discovered. By enthusiastic amateur, I wonder if he's suggesting it's possible that somebody thinking that way hasn't done a lot of gardening or farming. And then there's by the ecologically minded. And these are the points of view that I come to weeds with, because really a weed has an ecological definition, and that's that it's a pioneer of secondary succession. In plowed fields, more than anything, weeds are very closely associated with our sort of taking over large parts of the earth with agriculture and with everything else that we do to disturb the habitat. There are opportunistic species. And again, this word disturbance, we're going to talk about this a lot. Disturbance is anything from, you putting a trowel in the ground and moving some soil to the large scale projects that we do every day, building buildings and highways and everything else. It's all disturbance. Agriculture is a disturbance. We'll even see that lawns are a disturbance, because it's basically disturbing the natural succession that would be happening in that place if humans hadn't done this. It's not that other animals can't disturb ground too. They do. It's just that, like with so many things, our impact is sort of outsized. It's more than most. Okay. So let's move ahead with this ecological definition. Here we go. So that the ecological definition of a weed is an opportunistic species that follows human disturbance of the habitat. Now, there can be natural disturbance of the habitat, as we see here. When rivers, of course, migrate and deposit silt, that's like new habitat that doesn't have anything growing in it already. That's a disturbed habitat. That's where you get your early pioneers. A pioneer is somebody who goes to a new place. And for example, I was admiring the Joe Pye weed and sort of the sunflowers, I think, growing in this disturbed habitat, which was naturally created. So nature does create some disturbed habitat. That's why these weeds evolved in the first place. But then when humans came along, we really did a lot with disturbed habitats. And for example, here's the lamb's quarters, which are the chenopods. They really like disturbed habitats. And then, as I mentioned, the lawn is really a huge disturbed habitat. And that's another reason you can't just walk away and let your lawn go, because it's just going to revert to all sorts of other things because there's nothing natural about what's going on there right now. I want to go back one slide. Um, Speaking of the differing outlooks on weeds, I'm often struck when I talk to my dad. So broom sedge, for those of you in the native plant community, is really nice native grass. Has some very pretty winter interest, and you can see it across whole fields, and it almost has like a reddish tinge. And it's considered, good for the birds and lots of other things. And so anyway, I like broom sedge. My dad hates broom sedge. When he sees it, it's something to do something about because he's a farmer. And so farmers don't like broom sedge. It indicates poor soil. Now, poor soil means poor for agriculture. The soil is fine for whatever native plants want to live there, but you want a different soil for agriculture. So that means he would want to put lime on the landscape if he had broom sedge. But so this is just where it's okay to have differing views on these landscapes and by the way that you're using the landscape. It's funny. I've been thinking a lot about just our different attitudes and how we think about different plants. And I just had a funny thing happen the other day that I just wanted to mention in this talk. So this is one that I'm actually going to try to leave in my landscape. I have 3 acres, so I have a lot of stuff cropping up all the time. New weeds, new everything else. I mean, this is a pretty weedy plant. Just on Friday, my coworker was pointing this plant out to me and told me it was called 3-seeded Mercury. And I knew I'd seen it around a lot, but I can never remember what it's called. And I said, yeah, I got to start weeding that out of my acreage. And then the very next day, actually, I was talking to a botanist friend, and we were in a wildflower garden tour, and she said, look, there's 3-seeded Mercury. I'm so excited to see this. And she showed me all about, all the things she really loves about it. The most charismatic plant ever. It's not going to be something we're probably going to sell in the at Watermark Woods anytime soon, but it's just I notice how I think about milkweed and monarchs and how everybody came to love milkweed. It's interesting how your aesthetic appreciation can shift depending upon information you take in or even how you feel about that information. Okay, so this gets us back to invasive plants, which I do want to talk about a little bit. Hopefully most of you know about invasive plants and know not to buy them and to try to eradicate them from your landscapes if you can. You can get help for this from an organization called Blue Ridge Prism. You can also in Loudoun County get help from the master gardeners who will come to your property and do a survey of your invasives. And just to quickly go through this, so Bradford pear is a big one. This is barberry, which is constantly planted in new construction. It's thorny. I think nobody eats it. I guess the color is sort of pretty, but it's just really a shame because then when you're out on walks in places, you see it a lot out in nature, and it's displacing other things because it's just super successful and super tough. English ivy is a big problem. This is oriental bittersweet, which has crossed with our native bittersweet. This is burning bush, and this is autumn olive. And so all of these came from other continents. So they might do fine in those continents. Actually, Bradford pear not only came from a different continent, but also underwent some breeding that brought out certain qualities in it that allowed it to really be competitive. Yeah, so weeds are a personal choice, but please don't buy invasive plants and try to remove the invasive plants you have. Sometimes it's pointed out that invasive plants photosynthesize. Invasive plants can, they can have some positive qualities. There's nothing inherently horrible about them. It's just that in our particular in our ecosystem where they didn't evolve, they're not providing the same sorts of ecosystem services that we'd like, and at what cost in the loss of other native plants, and the biodiversity crisis that we're living through. One of the biggest threats to our native plants are invasive plants out in natural areas. And, some of these native plants, they just have a couple populations. And so if some invasive plants are successful and get out there, then that takes up space where the native plants could live. And we do want as much biodiversity in our landscape as possible, in all of our landscapes. There's the famous quote, I think, by E.O. Wilson, I think it was, about the rivets in the airplane, and how, you can lose a couple rivets in your airplane, but you don't want to lose too many. You don't want everything to come crashing down around you because you lost too many rivets. And that's how we think about biodiversity. So getting back to this, invasives and ordinary weeds, what's the difference? The dandelion could be a problem in your yard if you don't care for dandelions, or your neighbor doesn't, but that sort of stops at your fence where your disturbing stops. Whereas something like English ivy, an invasive plant, impacts the larger ecosystem because it continues to spread beyond areas that humans are actively disturbing. And that's why you see stiltgrass forever, for example, in all sorts of forests all over the place. It's just so competitive that it's now getting into places that we're not even actively disturbing. Okay, so now let's get sort of to the good side of using this weediness, using pioneer species in ways that can help us with our gardening. So I have what I call an early successional forest, and I wanted to have trees as well as some meadow plants, but I really like shade and I really like trees, and it feels like things want to be a forest here if you leave it to its own devices. So I had a bunch of trees planted, and I went with these pioneer species that are okay for an open environment. They fix nitrogen, many of them. They're okay in the sun, and they just will kind of grow like gangbusters. And so redbud is a particularly good one. I mean, what's more beautiful, right, than a redbud in the spring? Those flowers come out really early. They feed the early spring bees, the bees that are out in the early spring looking for something to eat, and they're beautiful. And the deer don't bother mine at all. They're one of the few things I grow outside my deer fence that the deer don't seem to bother. I don't know why that is. Black cherry is another beautiful one with beautiful cascading white flowers. And elderberry is a nice one too. It spreads clonally really, really rapidly. In fact, you really have to sort of hack it back every couple of years. And then also after the white flowers, it makes beautiful purple berries, and it supports this caterpillar, which I think is a Polyphemus caterpillar. I found it on the branches from time to time. So more pioneer species that you can use to your advantage in the landscape. Make use of these. Black locust and red cedar. So the red cedar is, that's what I remember coming up in the landscapes when you would abandon them. As you can see, it's a gymnosperm, and those little cones, those pretty blue cones, are valued by some birds. And black locust, those flowers are beautiful, great in the spring, and beekeepers really love this tree. It fixes nitrogen. It's very aggressive. So you do have to watch this one, because unless you have, these sorts of plants are for people with slightly larger landscapes, unless you're going to be extremely careful. So we're talking about sort of covering some ground, reclaiming yards, but they might be too aggressive for a very neat and tidy yard. Oh, I also want to point out that the thing about weediness is that these native species of ours are invasive elsewhere. I remember being in Italy and seeing black locust in a sort of disturbed area. Or in various areas, and thinking, I bet that's an invasive over here. And red cedar, I think our eastern red cedar is considered invasive in the western United States. So that's where it's important to, I think, as we discuss invasive plants, sometimes we get some pushback saying, well, how can you say that a plant is bad? And who are we to say as human beings that something in nature is good or bad? I guess I'm saying that there's no great moral sense in which these plants are good or bad. They are bad in these local environments because they didn't evolve here. And the time frame for them to evolve is much longer than we have, for them to evolve into any sort of relationship with the other organisms living here. So, so that's why, yeah, they could be invasive somewhere else. And let's move on to some more. Oh gosh. So this Canada goldenrod, I think it's a Canada goldenrod because those are the most aggressive goldenrods, was growing up in my parking lot, and I don't have the heart to cut it down because it's getting really, really pretty. And calico aster comes up in my yard. That's a beautiful aster. And I've been seeing all sorts of bees on these things. Just a little bit more about goldenrods and asters. And I saw this at the nursery the other day. It was a cold morning, so I think the bees were like, they just weren't moving around much at all. There's so many bees in this goldenrod. And don't forget, the goldenrod does not cause allergies. It happens to bloom at the same time as ragweed blooms. We don't have a picture of ragweed because it's too late to get a good picture of ragweed to show you what it looks like, but it's got, it doesn't have any pretty yellow flowers like this. If something has pretty yellow flowers like this, you can assume it was meant to attract bees, and therefore the pollen is moved around by bees, not by the wind. Ragweed causes allergies because the pollen is moved around by the wind. This pollen, I'm told, is too heavy to be moved around. And here's more of the calico asters just attracting those bees. These are very aggressive plants that I like to have in small amounts. Pokeweed is just the classic one for me. I feel like this whole presentation was based on my love of pokeweed. It's beautiful, and it's also problematic. I let it grow every year. I love the colors. I think it's so dramatic. It always takes over far more space than I want it to before I can get to it and hack it back. And then this time of year, it sort of starts to lean over and fall down and not look as good. I'm sure my neighbors hate it. It's a really pretty plant, though. Look at those colors, and these berries are valued by the bees. Of course, you don't want to eat these berries yourself. Levine milkweed is something that we sometimes sell in the nursery. And so when I saw it growing on my deer fence, I'm letting it grow there. I hope it doesn't get out of control and grow over the whole deer fence and drag it down. But it's another milkweed, it's related to that group, and you can tell by the pod there. This is the 5-leaved one that's not, sorry, it's not poison ivy. It's Parthenocissus. I'll think of it in a minute, and I'll tell you what it is. Okay, this biennial evening primrose, we sell this at the nursery too. These have beautiful yellow flowers. They can take over large swaths of my lawn if we don't mow it. And the reason I didn't put the yellow flowers in, but I put this from this time of year in, is that sometimes I see the goldfinches eating seeds out of these little pods here. A Virginia creeper, that's what I'm trying to say up here. Don't eat these berries either, but the Virginia creeper is very pretty and has red leaves in the fall. So these are all things that I like to have spread in my yard, but I like to not let them spread too far in my yard. And sometimes something goes in multiple categories, like blackberries, because I spend all this time trying to kill the blackberries. There's invasive ones that are non-native, and then there's native blackberries, and then of course there's blackberry crops. And I don't know what I have here, but I just keep hacking it back. But I keep stopping to eat the blackberries along the way because they're so tasty. So a lot of plants don't really fit in just one category or another. And then there's just fun stuff that pops up. Sometimes it's the stuff, well, actually, in these three cases, sometimes you'll buy, I think many people have had this experience. You'll buy something in the nursery and then you'll go home and you'll discover later you actually have this in your yard. You've just been overlooking it all this time. So self-heal is one that I found in my yard. And that's a prunella species. It's very sweet and forms small masses as a little ground cover. This is yarrow growing on that same awful bank where I was killing the blackberries. I was amazed to see how like pink these flowers are. Yarrow is typically white, but I can see that there's I'm sure this was never planted here because it just started showing up a few years ago. So it just shows that variation in nature that sometimes is selected for cultivars that are then sold in a nursery. And then purple lovegrass is one of my favorite plants, and I do sometimes buy it at the nursery because I just love the big um, like lavender mauve sprays of seed heads. But then I also sometimes just find it in the yard and it's like, oh, you've been here all along. So it's really fun to go looking around your yard and see what's already there and start to figure out, is it a weed you can tolerate that's not native, or is it a native wildflower that you just didn't even know about? Okay, so speaking of native ground covers, and let's see, we have violets up here. These were just in my yard, and I just started helping them spread on their own. Violets are just stunning every spring, and then by late summer, midsummer every year, I realize that's enough violets because the foliage just starts to look a little not as good. But anyway, they're really beautiful and they certainly do make a nice ground cover. This is Antonaria or Pussy Toes, and this is the uh, American Lady Butter. Oh gosh, caterpillar. I think it's the painted lady caterpillar. Anyway, that's what's known to be attracted by these wonderful little pussy toes, which put up really sweet little flowers in the spring. This is Virginia strawberry, which is a really nice ground cover that spreads nicely and you can eat the little strawberries. And this is Pacra aria. This is one of the things we recommend for people who need to cover somewhat large areas, maybe in partial shade. It can also take, I think, some sun. And it really does a great job of spreading, but it's also easy to pull out if you need to. These flowers come really early in the spring. So that's really good for our early spring pollinators. And then these leaves get quite large as the season progresses and really form a barrier where you're just not getting that many weeds. It really cuts down on your weeding because it blocks the weeds from coming up. So Pacra aria or golden ragwort is a really nice choice if you have weedy areas that you're really trying to fight back the weeds. And this is my favorite for that kind of thing. This is blue mist flower, conoclinum, and I'm always trying to spread this over larger areas in my yard. This blooms very late in the season. It's blooming like in September and now. Then there's non-native ground covers that when I find them, I like them. If I find out that they're becoming invasive somewhere, I'll start ripping them out. There's some creeping Charlie in here too, so ignore that. But this is the mock strawberry. So this is not a real strawberry. You can't. I mean, you can eat it, but it doesn't taste like anything. And but there's certain areas in my yard where that makes a nice little cover. Smartweed is another non-native. That I just happen to like. I think it's got a pretty, I like weeds. I think they're pretty. Again, somebody suggested the other day to me that it might be becoming invasive. If so, I won't be so liberal about letting it just take off. But it's a nice one to cover areas where there's nothing else growing because, nature abhors a vacuum. So you need to have something growing there. And then it's very easy to pull out if you don't want it there anymore. Okay, so speaking of ground covers, so this is I read a book that called this the industrial monoculture lawn, and this is the freedom lawn. And you know what? You can make any sort of choice in between, but just know that this one here, it requires a lot of inputs, and the reason it requires a lot of inputs is that nature doesn't naturally form a monoculture. That's a very hard thing to keep going. It requires chemicals, it requires water to really do it well. It requires so many inputs, and those are inputs that are just going to grow lawn grass. So it's just holding back that succession for whatever this landscape would like to be. So it really kind of comes out of our industrially processed inputs. And this is the freedom lawn, and it might not be everybody's choice, but I like these little, what do we call these? Lance leaf, Plantago lanceolata, the lance leaf plantain. Anyway, and it's supporting this little skipper butterfly. And of course, clover, right? Clover is not native either. Neither is this plant, but I think they're lovely little weeds and they do an excellent job, and it's holding the soil in place. And as we're thinking about moving away from lawns and things like that, you want to think about legibility and intentionality. I saw a great example of this the other day at Oak Spring Garden in Upperville, where they had a beautiful riot of, it's just a huge wildflower garden, and so nicely kept, but really like tons of plants. And what keeps it really neat and tidy and legible are the paths through there. Here's a great example of, just in case you think you can't do this in the suburbs, Allison Gallo and Brian Henson have a place in Countryside, I think, and they do a wonderful job of having native plants all over their yard. Oh, and since we're coming into fall, don't forget to leave the leaves. This is my last slide, but I had to get this in. If you can leave the leaves, if you like fireflies and lightning bugs, that is, you really want to leave the leaves, because that's where the larvae need to live over winter, and all sorts of other little insects. And our insects are really important, and we need to protect the larvae who need to live there. So try to leave your leaves, or if you can't, try to pile them up in one place. Okay, so thank you very much. This is my website down here if you want to learn more about some of the stuff I do. And if there's any questions, that would be great.